The morning of my son's graduation, I made biscuits from scratch. Not the kind from a can, the real kind, the ones my mother taught me, where you cut cold butter into the flour with your fingers until it looks like rough sand, where you knead it just enough and not a single press more. I've been up since 5:30. The kitchen windows were still dark when I turned the oven on, and I stood there in my housecoat listening to the burner click to life, thinking about how I'd made those same biscuits the morning he was born, 31 years ago. I'd had to leave half the batch unfinished when the contractions got too close together. I finished them this time. I made 12, arranged them on the good platter, the one with the blue rim my sister gave me when I moved into this house, and I set the table the way I always do when something matters. The good napkins folded into triangles, orange juice in real glasses, not plastic. Butter softened on a small dish. A jar of the peach preserves I'd put up last August, because he'd always said nobody's preserves tasted like mine. I stood back and looked at the table and felt that particular kind of happiness that only comes from making a place look like someone is loved. He never came. I need to back up because that sentence alone doesn't explain anything, and the thing I've learned at 64 is that the stories that hurt the most never make sense in a single line. His name is Colin. My son. He's 31 years old, and for most of those years I thought I knew exactly who he was. Thoughtful. A little quiet. The kind of boy who would come in from playing outside and ask if I needed help with anything before he even took his shoes off. He got that from his father. My husband Glenn was the same way. Glenn passed 11 years ago, and some days I still catch myself turning to say something to him before I remember. Colin was always Glenn's boy in that way. Steady. Considerate. I thought he'd gone back to school at 28, which took more courage than most people would ever know. He'd spent his 20s doing warehouse work, honest work, and I never once made him feel small for it, because I knew what it was like to do work that wears your body down just to keep the lights on. But he'd always wanted to finish his degree, and when he finally enrolled, I told him, whatever you need, we figure it out together. And we did. The first year, I helped with his rent when his hours got cut. The second year, I co-signed the loan on his used car when his broke down and he couldn't get to campus without it. The third year, this past year, his girlfriend, who I'll call Annette, moved in with him, and his expenses doubled in ways I don't fully understand, and I found myself writing checks I hadn't planned on writing. Not big amounts, 100 here, 300 there. Once, almost 800 when the car needed repairs, and they were both between paychecks. I didn't keep perfect records. That was my mistake, I think. Not the giving, but the not counting. Because when you don't count, you stop seeing the shape of what's happening. By spring, I'd given him somewhere close to $14,000 over those 3 years. I know because I finally sat down in February with my bank statements spread across the kitchen table and added it up. And I had to sit with that number for a long time before I could move on with my day. $14,000. Not a complaint, not a condition, just a fact I hadn't looked at straight until then. The graduation was in May. He told me about it in March, texted me a photo of the invite with a heart emoji, and I'd screenshotted and saved it to a folder on my phone that I'd labeled Colin Good Things, which sounds embarrassing to say out loud, but I don't care. I was proud. I am proud, even now. Getting that degree at 31 while working and managing a whole life, that takes something most people don't have. I started planning the breakfast the week before. I asked him what he wanted, and he said, "Oh, whatever you make is always good, Mom," which I took as permission to make everything I knew he loved. Biscuits, scrambled eggs with chives, sausage links, sliced fruit, the peach preserves. I even bought a small arrangement from the grocery store, yellow flowers in a short vase. Nothing fancy, just enough to make the table feel celebratory. The night before, I pressed his favorite blue shirt. He'd left it here at Thanksgiving and never taken it back, and I'd washed and hung it in the guest closet, thinking he'd want it for a special occasion. I set it out on the bed in there, along with a card I'd written 4 drafts of before I settled on the right words. Simple words. Not too much. Just, I've always known you would get here. I love you more than you will ever know. I went to sleep thinking about how his face would look when he walked in. At 6:45 the next morning, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I was already awake, already in the kitchen, already had the oven going. I dried my hands on a dish towel and picked up the phone. It was a text from Annette's number. I should tell you, I'd only met Annette 4 times. She was perfectly pleasant each of those times. Polite in the way people are polite when they're performing politeness, and I'd always felt a slight coolness there that I told myself was just shyness. You understand, right? When you've been a mother as long as I have, you develop a sense for things. And the sense I had about Annette was that she tolerated me the way you tolerate weather. Not unkind about it, just waiting for it to pass. The text said, "Hey, Colin asked me to reach out. His family is doing breakfast at the Willowmere before the ceremony. He thought it would be less stressful than everyone driving to your place. Hope that's okay. He said he'll see you at the ceremony." Shh. I read it twice. His family. I stood in my kitchen. In the kitchen, where I taught him how to scramble eggs, where he'd done homework at the counter every night, from 3rd grade through senior year. Where I'd held him while he cried the night his father died. And I read those 2 words until they stopped looking like words. His family. I set the phone down on the counter and looked at the table I'd set. The good napkins, the peach preserves, the yellow flowers, the blue shirt pressed and waiting in the other room. I went back to the oven and I finished the biscuits. I'm not entirely sure why. Habit, maybe? Or something more stubborn than habit. The part of you that refuses to let someone else's behavior change who you are in the privacy of your own kitchen. I finished the biscuits, put them on the platter, and stood at the counter and ate 2 of them standing up, alone, looking at the yellow flowers. Then I drove to my neighbor Phyllis's house and left the rest of the food on her porch with a note that said simply, "Made too much. Enjoy. P.S. The preserves are from last summer." Then I went to the graduation. I sat in the bleachers in the university gymnasium. And I watched my son walk across that stage, and I clapped, and I cried. Real tears, the good kind. Because whatever else was happening, this moment was real, and it was his, and no text from a phone I didn't fully understand could take that from me. Afterward, I found him in the crowd. He was with Annette and her parents, and 2 people I'd never seen before who I gathered were her aunts. He hugged me, a quick hug, the kind with one arm, the kind that means the person's attention is already somewhere else. He said, "Mom, I'm glad you made it." Like I was an acquaintance who'd shown up to support a good cause. I made it. I drove home alone. That evening, I sat on my back porch with a glass of iced tea, and I thought about my own mother. She passed 15 years ago, and she was not a soft woman. She was the kind of person who loved you, in a language you had to learn to read, through packed lunches and ironed collars and showing up places early. We had our difficulties. I was not always the daughter I should have been in my 20s, and I know she felt that. But when I graduated from nursing school, just a 2-year program, nothing fancy, she made a pound cake from scratch and wore her good dress and cried in a way I'd never seen her cry before, and I have thought about that pound cake more times than I can count. My son was already calling me less in the months leading up to this. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. Not gone, we texted, we spoke maybe twice a month, but the texture of our relationship had changed, and I've been telling myself it was the stress of finishing school, the busyness of building a life, the ordinary drift that happens when children become full adults with full lives. I've been telling myself a story. The story I'd been telling myself was, this is temporary. When the degree is done, things will settle. He'll have more time. You'll have Sunday dinners again. He just needs to get through this. A week after graduation, he called to tell me that he and Annette were moving to her family city, a 14-hour drive from here. He said it matter-of-factly, the way you'd tell someone about a change to a flight schedule. He'd already accepted a job. They'd already signed a lease. We've been talking about it for months, he said. I asked why he hadn't mentioned it. There was a pause. I didn't want to make it a whole thing. I didn't want to make it a whole thing. I didn't want to make it a whole thing. I think that was the sentence that finally made me understand. Not the graduation breakfast I'd been replaced at, not the text from Annette's phone like I was a scheduling conflict, not even the $14,000 I'd written out of my savings over 3 years, a third of which I'd been counting on to replace my water heater and repair the back fence. It was that sentence. I didn't want to make it a whole thing. That told me something true about how small I had become in my own son's life. Not a whole thing. A thing to manage, to minimize, to send an assistant text to handle. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in bed, and I looked at the ceiling, and I thought about Glenn, because I always think about Glenn when things get hard, and I wondered what he would have said. Glenn was quiet, but he was clear. He had a way of cutting through the noise of a situation and finding the simple truth at the center of it. I think he would have said, "You taught him that you'd absorb it. You taught him that you could be set aside and you'd still be there. That's not his fault. That's yours to undo." I got up at 2 in the morning and went to the kitchen and sat down with a notepad. I wrote down everything I'd given. Not to be angry about it. I genuinely wasn't angry. Not exactly. It was something more complicated than anger. But because I needed to see it as a shape. The co-signed loan, the rent payments, the car repairs, the grocery runs the year he and Annette moved in together and suddenly couldn't make ends meet. The graduation outfit I bought him that he'd never mentioned wearing. The $14,000, give or take, over 3 years. Then I wrote down what I had coming up. The water heater was 8 years past its expected lifespan. The back fence had been patched 3 times and wasn't going to survive another winter. My car needed new brakes and 2 new tires. My own savings, which I'd planned to leave mostly untouched until I needed care, had a new shape now. Smaller, softer at the edges. I sat with that for a long time. What I felt was not anger. I want to say that again because I think it's important to get right. What I felt was more like grief. Not for the money, but for the story I'd been living inside. The one where I was central. The one where the biscuits meant something. The one where pressing a shirt and writing 4 drafts of a card was a language someone was still listening to. In the morning, I called my bank. I set up a transfer from the account I'd been using for Colin's expenses into a separate savings account I labeled in the notes, for the fence. No announcement. No ultimatum. No letter explaining myself. I just changed where the money flowed, the way a creek changes course after a long rain. Quietly, necessarily, following the new shape of the land. I did not call Colin to tell him. He called me. About 3 weeks later, they'd moved. He was settling in. He wanted to know if I could help with the security deposit on a storage unit. They had more furniture than the new apartment could fit. I told him no, not this time. There was a silence. "Oh," he said. "Okay. And then, is everything all right?" I told him everything was fine. I told him I was proud of him. I told him the new city sounded like a real opportunity, and I meant it. I genuinely meant it. What I did not tell him was that I had looked at a travel brochure that morning for the first time in 11 years. A small trip. Nothing extravagant. A few days on the coast. A place I'd always said I wanted to go when there was time. When things were settled. When the moment was right. I'd spent 11 years waiting for the moment to be right. I'd been waiting for some finish line. For Colin to be stable. For the house to be in order. For everything to be handled. Before I allowed myself to want things that were only for me. I booked the trip that afternoon. 4 nights in a room with a window that faced the water. I packed the kind of things I never pack. A good book I'd been meaning to read for 2 years, a journal I'd had for 5 and never opened, a dress I liked and had never worn anywhere. I left on a Tuesday morning, which felt like the right kind of ordinary for something that was also quietly extraordinary. The drive took 5 hours. I stopped once, at a diner outside a small town I'd never heard of, and I sat at the counter and ordered eggs and toast and coffee, and the woman behind the counter asked if I was passing through or heading somewhere, and I said, heading somewhere, and she said, that's the best kind. I thought about that for the rest of the drive. I want to be careful about how I end this, because I don't want to suggest that I've stopped loving my son, or that love and limits are opposites of each other. They're not. I love him exactly as much as I ever did. And I think I finally understand that the love was never the problem. The shape of it was. The love I'd been giving was the kind that asks nothing and absorbs everything. The kind that makes itself so convenient and so available that it stops being seen at all. It becomes furniture. It becomes weather. I don't want to be weather. Phyllis, my neighbor. She called me the day I got back from the coast, and I told her about all of it, the graduation and the text and the storage unit and the trip, and she listened without interrupting, which is a gift not everyone knows how to give. When I was done, she said, "You didn't stop being his mother. You started being yourself again." I've thought about that every day since. He called me last Sunday. We talked for almost 40 minutes, longer than we'd talked in over a year. He asked about the trip because I'd sent him one photo while I was there, just one, of the view from my window at sunset, and he'd texted back, "Mom, wow." He asked if I'd go back. He asked how the biscuits turned out. I'd mentioned I made them for Phyllis, and he said he missed them, and he said it in a way that sounded like he meant more than just the biscuits. I said, "Come visit sometime. The real kind of visit, where you stay a few days, where we sit on the porch in the evening." He said he would try. I held that lightly, not with bitterness, not with need. Just held it the way you hold something small and warm, carefully, without gripping. I went back to the kitchen after we hung up. I looked at the table, the same one I'd set back in May, and I thought about who had sat at it and who hadn't, and what it had cost me to keep setting it for people who didn't always show up. Then I got out the flour and the butter and started a batch for no reason at all. Just for me. Just because I wanted to. And I have to tell you, they were the best ones I ever made. I've been thinking a lot lately about the word absorb. How some people learn, early on, that certain people in their lives will absorb whatever they put out. The last-minute cancellations, the silence, the casual reordering of priorities. And those people will still be there, still warm, still with the biscuits on the table. I taught Colin that I was that kind of person. I didn't mean to. I thought I was teaching him that love was unconditional. And I still believe that's true. But somewhere along the way, unconditional love became unconditional availability, and those are not the same thing. One is a gift. The other is an erasure, the cause and the effect. When I finally looked at them straight, I gave without tracking, so he received without noticing. I adjusted without saying anything, so he never learned there was anything to adjust to. I pressed the shirt and wrote the card and set the table and said nothing when the table went unsatted at. And so the message I sent, over and over, without ever meaning to, was, "I don't require anything from you. You can place me anywhere in your life that's convenient, and I will stay there." That's not love. That's furniture. What I know now, and I say this not with bitterness because I genuinely don't feel bitter, I feel clear, is that the most honest thing I ever did for my son was say, "Not this time," to the storage unit. Not as punishment, not as a lesson I was trying to teach him, just as the truth. I didn't have it to give, and so I didn't give it. Simple. Quiet. No speech required. The hard thing about integrity is that it doesn't announce itself. It just shows up in the small moments. In finishing the biscuits anyway, in driving to the graduation anyway, in not calling to explain yourself, in booking the trip, in sitting at a diner counter in a town you've never heard of and telling a stranger you're heading somewhere. Integrity is what you do in your own kitchen when no one is watching. I think about the woman I was 10 years ago, 11 years ago, right after Glenn passed. How I poured everything I had left into Colin because he was what remained of the family we'd built. And how that was exactly the right thing to do then, and exactly the wrong thing to keep doing forever. Grief has its own timing. So does letting go. What Phyllis said to me, you didn't stop being his mother, you started being yourself again. I think that's the truest thing anyone has said to me in years. Because those two things had stopped feeling compatible somewhere along the way, and they should never be incompatible. Being a mother is not the same as disappearing. Loving your child is not the same as making yourself small enough to fit wherever they put you. The trip changed something in me, not dramatically. I didn't come back a different person. I came back the same person, just standing a little straighter. There's a window somewhere on the coast that faces the water, and I sat in front of it for 4 evenings in a row. And I remembered that I am someone who has things she wants. That sounds like such a small thing. It is not a small thing. Colin called. We talked for 40 minutes. He asked about the biscuits. That's where I'll leave it. Not at the wound, but at the 40 minutes. Because that's what happens when you stop making yourself so easy to overlook. People start to look.